Beginning of 1971, and the organisation was called Socialist Action League, and I remained a member of that until 1991, exactly 20 years. And the organisation played a pretty important role in a lot of those movements, and in some cases a central leadership role. It emerged, the group emerged out of the Victoria University Socialist Club, which started publishing a little magazine called Red Spark in '69, and then went on to the production of a fortnightly newspaper starting in 1970 that continued through to about when I left the organisation. So for the next 20 years it published religiously every fortnight. It began as a cyclophile sheet on a Gestetner. It moved on to a sort of a broadsheet sort of format. This is the magazine supplement, but in the sort of basic broadsheet format, and has accumulated in these volumes, which provide a pretty thorough, if you go through a pretty thorough record of exactly what happened and when during those years. Red Spark was a group in Wellington. Victoria University went on to found Socialist Action, as I said. Branches were soon established in Auckland and Christchurch. In Christchurch, the majority of the Progressive Youth Movement, which was a youth group that had been started by the Communist Party in Christchurch, defected and joined and established itself as a branch of the League. And the League took as its central initial responsibility the organisation of the movement against the Vietnam War. The largest demonstration up to that time had been in October 1970 of 1,000. Due to the work essentially of the League to a degree the expelled Wellington branch of the Communist Party also, but confined to Wellington, but through the League we established a national anti-war coalition in March, and the first national anti-war mobilisation on April 30th, 1971. So we went from 1,000 in Auckland in October 1970 to 17,000 in Auckland in April 1971, and a strike of Auckland University essentially for the day. Thousands of a high school student anti-war group, which I was the coordinator of it, drawing in thousands of high school students into the protest, and it was such a stunning event that with similar sized marches up and down across the country that it was a little bit of a turning point in New Zealand politics. It's sort of the mass protests had emerged in a way that had never been seen before, and it had been principally due to the sort of a clear strategic perspective around United Front activity on the part of this small, very new socialist group. Through the 70s and 80s, there was also a major rise of the women's rights movement, women's liberation movement, the United Women's Convention, National Women's Liberation Congresses, and a fight around the abortion laws. That was the central issue, which kept coming back again and again with more and more anti-abortion laws. The Parliament kept trying to pass more restrictive abortion laws, and the fight against that, and the principal activist organisation involved in that was the National Abortion Action Campaign. Again, the central role played by Socialist Action League women. The Working Women's Charter was developed, which was a very radical charter, including abortion rights developed for the trade union movement, and it was campaigned for and fought in every union in the country and debated at stop work meetings. And again, Socialist Action League women played a central role in that. I remember I remember going to meetings with one of the women leaders of the leagues, Pat Starkey, who would be speaking to a meeting, and these were mass stop work meetings, like up in the Drivers' Union, 2,000 workers at the town hall, debating the Working Women's Charter, overwhelmingly male, but still overwhelmingly endorsing the Charter, including what were seen as the controversial issues, including abortion rights, and the sort of whole program for childcare, abortion rights, whole program for abortion rights. This was debated and won in workplaces and mass meetings up and down the country. There was affirmative active fights to get jobs, for women to get jobs in industry, in the meatworks, to become butchers. Women members of the league were part of those fights, not only them, of course, but were part of those fights for affirmative action. There was a strong political student, political student movement. Socialist Action League tended to be the principal group at Auckland University, and it followed. The organisation established itself and then moved on to get jobs in industry in the late 1970s, and at the same time there was a deep radicalisation and working class struggle. There was fight after fight, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers going on strike, being locked out, and we were centrally involved. But what we built was, and just what I want to sort of finish on this, during those entire 20 years we had a fortnightly newspaper that was seen as the movement newspaper. If you were a working class militant, you wanted to read about the strikes. If you were a Māori rights activist, you wanted to read Socialist Action. It had a page dedicated to it, called Te Aotearoa, but it wasn't just that page. It was full of issues: Basing Point land occupation, the Raglan occupation, the first Hikois, Māori Land March. This was the paper to read. Thousands of copies were sold. Thousands of subscriptions were sold. Each year there was a subscription drive. There was 1,000 of between 1,000 and 2,000 subscriptions were sold each year at the beginning of the year. Tens of thousands of dollars were raised. And the fund appeals for Socialist Action was in the 1970s was 10,000. In the 1980s, but the last one I looked at was 40,000 in 1986. This would be 100, 150,000 today. I don't know, maybe even pushing $200,000. 3 people worked full-time in the newspaper. We had branch meeting halls, bookshops in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. We had a weekly forum program in each of those in each of those cities. We had educational conferences at the end of every year, a 5 or 6 day educational conference at the end of every year. It was a very professional, dedicated organisation which was able to play an important role in many of these struggles because of that professionalism, because of that that dedication, because it took itself seriously, as well as the movements that it was part of seriously.
Excellent.
Through the 70s and 80s, there were periods of working class and political advance and radicalisation. The 1990s, however, was a different kettle of fish, and you almost had a feeling that it was onwards ever upwards. You know, like for 2 decades of my life, it seemed to get better. You know, that every year the strikes were bigger and better, and the battles were and we kept delivering blows on the ruling class, and real wages, real living standards were increasing, and the right-wing enemy of the working class in the form of the Prime Minister Muldoon would be considered a left-wing Prime Minister today in his economic and social policy, given that he was a dedicated Keynesian. But Keynesianism is also believes you've got to control wages and as well. So those battles continue right through to the mid-80s and to the formation of that first Labour government, and then a period of political and economic retreat set in, and the devastation of a deep-going economic recession and political retreat on the part of the working class and its organisations. So that ferment, solidarity, action turned into almost zero. And the response of the group that I was part of was to retreat into a church-like adherence to a faith rather than confronting that reality and just trying to. However, that is not unusual or unique in the world, but in the part of organisations of the left, in particular, organisations that see themselves as part of the revolutionary or Marxist left. In fact, it is a very common thing to happen. Organisations of sometimes many thousands of dedicated individuals implode or go off on adventurous sort of courses in sort of one direction, and the problem is rooted in the fact that in fact these organisations have a political program which is for working class liberation, but to a large extent they live outside of the daily life and struggles of working class people, and so that the pressures for that church-like response to turn inward and to protect the sect seems to become overwhelming, and that's part of the objective problem of the level. I think the objective problem and the pressures of the levels of class struggle, and especially over the last few decades. And I don't think there is an exception to that of any, in a sense that you know, all groups have their, in a sense, all the groups have their day, but it seems that they all have their denouement as well in many cases. So that's just a reality. I don't know the solution to that. My personal solution was to do something a little different, rather than at the end of that 2-day exec set up the Treen party. It was to focus on, as a Marxist, and I remain a Marxist and committed to that perspective, but of having a orientation, of having a more mass or outlook and orientation, and the job is to sort of politically organise on a mass level.
Well, we just have to leave it there for a sec. Omar, you got